Hello Bio, this is Mr. B, and we are on our last video for Chapter 10. We're now in Section 3, and it's called Regulating the Cell Cycle. So we've learned up to this point what the cell cycle is, what happens when our cells want to grow and divide, and now we're going to look at how this cycle can be regulated. Another word for regulating is just controlling or kind of manipulating to figure out how the cell cycle is going to work. So some experiments show that normal cells will reproduce until they come into contact with other cells. So that's kind of one of our first controls on cell division, that our cells, when they're normal, they will only reproduce unless they come into contact with another cell. So when they come into contact with other cells, they respond by not growing. So that's normal cells. When they bump into one cell, they stop growing. And this demonstrates that controls on cell growth and division can be turned on and off. So if we wanted to be scientists studying this, we could kind of take an in-depth look and see what kind of actual things are going on in the cell when they're not touching something, when they're growing normally, then when they are touching another cell, and kind of something different's going on because they stop growing. And this process of not growing when they come into contact with another cell is called contact inhibition. So that's important there. It's called contact inhibition when cells stop growing whenever they come into contact with another cell. So you can see, we'll look at some pictures here. Over here on our far left, we have a normal petri dish with some cells growing in it. And then the cells are not touching each other, so they're growing. And then when they all grow into each other, some in the middle, they die off, they stop growing. So all those cells in the middle that we're touching have died off because of contact inhibition. They only grow when there's no other cells present. And then look, you can see in our next step is they start up growing again until they get to this process, and then it'll just kind of be a continuing cycle from there. So the cell's ability to stop growing when it comes into contact with another cell is called contact inhibition. And so that's just one way that the cell cycle is kind of regulated. And now we're going to look at kind of some other ways on how the cell cycle is regulated. And they are regulated by a specific protein. So this process back here, this contact inhibition, it is regulated or controlled by a specific protein. And the amount of this protein in the cell rises and falls in time with the cell cycle. So scientists have actually looked at have looked at cells in different stages of the cell cycle, and they have determined that this protein is present in different amounts when the cell is in different stages. And they called this protein cyclin because it seems to regulate the cell cycle. So that's actually one of the times in science where a name is actually kind of helpful to tell you what it does. So a cyclin is going to regulate the cell cycle. And again, this is just a definition of the cyclins. They regulate the timing of the cell cycle in eukaryotic cells. So that's going to be an important term to know, is the cyclins, that they regulate the timing of the cell cycle in eukaryotic cells. And we have two different types of cyclins. We have what are called internal regulators, and these are the proteins that respond to events inside the cell. So inside, internal, kind of self-explanatory. And their kind of job is to allow the cell cycle to proceed only when certain processes have happened inside the cell. So an internal regulator will only allow the cell cycle to proceed when something has been produced or made, or some specific thing happens inside the cell. So that's our first type, internal regulators. Our next type are external regulators. These are proteins that respond to events outside the cell. And so they direct cells to speed up or slow down the cell cycle. So that's their main job. Kind of based off what's going on outside of the cell, they tell the cell whether it'll be beneficial to speed up or slow down the cell cycle. So that's everything about a normal cell. So we have the internal and external regulators. So now we're going to look at what happens when those regulators aren't working. So what happens when we have uncontrolled cell growth. And when we have uncontrolled cell growth, that's what we have, is called cancer. And cancer is a disorder in which some of the body's own cells lose the ability to control growth. So we had someone ask in class one day, what happens when cells just keep growing and growing? And that's basically is cancer. It's when our cells, they literally cannot control the ability to grow, and they just keep growing and growing. And we're going to take a look at how cancer cells are different from our other cells. So what causes them to just grow and grow without any other controls? And the main difference being that they do not respond to the signals that regulate the growth of most cells. So it's pretty much as simple as that. that the cancer cells just don't respond to that contact inhibition, to those internal and external regulators that we talked about. And they divide uncontrollably, and they form masses of cells called tumors that can damage the surrounding tissue. So I think we've all heard of the term tumor before, and that's simply just a mass of cells that grow and grow and grow and will not stop. And some other things about these tumors or cancer cells: they may break loose and they may spread throughout the body. So we could have a tumor and some cancer cells break loose and they could form in other areas, and this would disrupt the normal activities and cause serious medical problems or even death. So that's a pretty serious disease here, and we're still trying to do a lot of research into it. And so that is it for chapter 10. Let me know if you have any questions.